Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CLSR. And I'm your host, the counselor. Want to talk to you today about grief and loss. See, a few months have gone by, and I find myself even dealing with some loss. And I guess I could say I'm in a grieving state. Family member of mine had just passed away from COVID-19, and I'm feeling rather at a loss for sure because I didn't really get to say my goodbyes. And this is a person that was really close to me, especially as I grew up. I had a lot of love for this aunt of mine, and she was always there for me. And whenever I think of her, it's kind of hard because I think she deserved better. And I'm got all these emotions and feelings, and they're coming out in different ways in my family. Whether it's being a little bit short with people or arguing, or disagreements about who she was, and I have a different perspective from other people, but it's just been really hard trying to deal with it. And I know there's a part of me that just feels like I'm holding something, and there's so many emotions going on inside me that I'm sure a lot of people are out there having some problems as well, because they have, if someone's not passed away, then they could be sick right now, and they could be worried to death, worried and stressed out that this person might not make it, or they caught the virus and they don't feel completely helpless. And that's understandable when you feel completely helpless, because if we're being honest with each other, there is no cure. And see, with my aunt, I felt completely helpless. Going to see her, I couldn't get in to see her. There's an iron ring, which means there's a whole lockdown on the retirement home. And I remember going there frequently and visiting her prior to this COVID-19. And we had such a good relationship. It seemed like she's the only one that really understood me. And she would take the time to talk to me. And it was just wonderful. And you think she could live for at least another 20 years, but unfortunately, that's not the case. That's not what happened. And as I got busier, time went on, and the worry that I had for her increased. Tried everything, tried calling her, writing her a few letters. I showed up initially until they cut me out of this program, and that had made me feel real bad because I felt like I was letting her down. I wasn't holding up my end of the bargain, although I knew it was a totally different game. And I'm sure she understood too. However, it's not fair any way you look at it when you have somebody who's really ill, who's caught it and passed on. But see, during those times when she was dealing with it, it became a real stressor for me because I felt like there was a distance between us, and I was always on high alert as to when I was going to get that call. And so I just received that call recently. And it's just making me realize, number one, how precious life is, and how people you get so close to, people who you love in your family, one minute they're there and the next minute they're gone. And it saddens me because there are millions of people out there dealing with the same right now. They have to deal with that regularly. They have to deal with this loss, this grief. And do we really understand what grief is? I mean, grief is really a natural response to loss. It's the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. And quite often, this pain of loss, it can be excessive, quite overwhelming. You experience difficult and unexpected emotions like I've been feeling. First, it was anger. I was really angry. And that's common too. You get angry at the system because you think, is there anything that was done that, could have made the situation better? Um, I started to get angry at the system because I started to hear all the news reels about people who are in the retirement homes who were being mistreated, how the military went into a couple retirement homes and found that it was disgusting. And I was just wondering about her. I was wondering if my aunt had really gotten to that point where she was being mistreated. I knew she was sick, but was she treated properly? Were they leaving her? Because I heard some horror stories about how some people were treated during those times. Some were left with food in their mouths, laying in beds with bed sores, um, just left hungry. Could you imagine that type of suffering when you have nobody around? And it could easily happen, especially when you don't have a family member who's visiting you anymore. There's an iron curtain around the retirement home, so they're not visiting their family members, checking up on them, making sure that they're taken care of. That is going to blow your mind. It's going to leave you with some real trauma because you feel totally helpless. And that person that you love in your family, whether they're being taken care of properly or improperly, you do not know. Now you have to contact or communicate with somebody who's working in the retirement home. And thank goodness I had someone I could communicate with. That was one of the first things. Once I knew that there wasn't going to be any regular communication between my aunt and myself, I established communication with one of the staff members. And I got to tell you, that was one of the best decisions that I made, because the frontline workers that are working, the personal support workers working in the retirement homes, they're doing an excellent job. I think they're underappreciated. They've always been undervalued. But this is a time now where we really realize that these people can even help us when we're feeling our pain. They can help bring a little bit of security back to us, especially when we're not communicating with our family members and we have a loved one that's in one of their facilities. So me having that communication with a employee who just told me little things, discuss things and how things were going, and if my aunt needed something, I could communicate with them. But it was a real process. I could never see them, but they were. I knew them from before, so I just made that communication. So whereas I could talk to them and get some information, and that was sufficient for a while. But as time went on and my aunt's condition became worse, I felt like I needed more. I couldn't even believe. I almost got into this state of mind where I was in a shock. I knew what was going to happen, but I felt like as if I couldn't do anything about it. It was almost like a disbelief. It went from anger to all these emotions, and it got into the disbelief. And then I started feeling guilty that I wasn't holding my end of the bargain up, that I could do more. You know, I found that the PPE was lacking. So I was really starting to feel profound sadness. And the pain of grief can also disrupt anything that goes on in your life, especially your physical health. I wasn't eating properly. It was making it difficult for me to sleep. I couldn't even think straight because that's all that was consuming my mind. She was all that I could think about. And believe it or not, this was really a normal reaction for after I spoke with a couple people. They said, yeah, they were going through the same. The small group of people around my neighborhood that, we started talking about it, and there are a number of people who are dealing with the same as myself. And I just found out a lot of them are dealing with it too. The sleep disorders, overeating, healthy. They're not staying as healthy as they normally were. Things were just falling down. And this was because it was a part of grief, you know? And I just found out when I was listening to them, the more significant the loss, it seemed like the more intense the grief would be. See, when you're coping with loss of someone, like my aunt, someone that you love, this is one of life's big challenges because it starts to get you to think about how precious life is and how we only have so much time on this earth. But this pandemic, whoa, now you get to see a number of people going through it. And it just feels like a desperate situation, because a lot of people are going to have to deal with death in a loved ones. And this is why there's a lot of grief out there before a pandemic. It's just people had to deal with grief. But how do they do it? Well, it's not just about grieving when someone's lost. There are other things that get people to grieve, right? People grieve in their relationships. When there's a divorce or a situation where they've separated, might have been together for years, but they're grieving. You break up, you miss that person, you're not really dealing with anybody else. It becomes a tragic situation. Some people just move on, but there are some people who have difficulty moving on and they grieve. And this also, what about your health? That they say those are some of the symptoms. Your health starts to deteriorate. Well, when you know that, people start to grieve for you. When they start to see that heavy breathing, you've seen it on television where some of the media outlets are talking about people showing them having a hard time breathing, hooking up all those ventilators, and people are just breathing until they expire. That's grief as well. These are just understanding that you can grieve in many different uh, areas of your life. People lose a job. It's some people don't have that impact them, but there are other people who just losing a job, they'll grieve. They will. They'll go into a sense of, you know, doubt, insecurity, a feelings of loss because losing a job. Losing a job for some might not seem so bad, but it could be a real situation for those people who might have spent years working at a job, and all of a sudden you're used to a certain lifestyle and you don't have that anymore because of even this pandemic. So you can grieve when you're losing a job. If you had kids to take care of and you're trying to pay for those kids, just losing that job is going to impact your whole life and their life. You know, loss of financial stability it's happened to a lot of people today. And that is going to be the health of this country, the mental health, right? When people they can't even depend on their basic financial stability, then things start to fall apart and people start to grieve. Couldn't imagine. Retirement. What about the people who had the jobs and then they have to go into retirement and they feel that they're not useful anymore or they don't play a role or they have no purpose in society? Some people, once they stop that work engagement and that participation in society, right, where they have to retire, some do grieve because it's something that's deep down inside them that's hurting. They're going to miss some things that they're used to, that relationship, camaraderie, that dependency on work, that active feeling, that involvement, participation in society. They grieve. They do. I saw a friend the other day who lost a pet. He was down. Just changed. His whole attitude changed. Lost his pet. Got ran over by a car, unfortunately. And he's still grieving. Doesn't even want to talk about it. I don't even say the pet's name. Because, he just, no, he doesn't even want to talk about it. Doesn't even want to hear about the name. They're just grieving. They're locking themselves in and locking themselves down. You know. There's people that grieve in all different kinds of ways. We have to understand what it can be grief. It doesn't just mean death. There are people who are dreamers. If you're a dreamer and you've been dreaming these dreams, and then you've come to the realization that that cherished dream is not going to happen, you might grieve. And some people spend years trying to make up those feelings and, regain that dream, recapture it. But when they can't, they start to grieve, you know? Just think of your partner, their health deteriorating right in front of your eyes. And they have a serious illness and there's nothing. You're trying everything that you could possibly do, aside from being there every day. And you're there for them, watching them deteriorate, watching everything in the past just culminate to the future where it doesn't make sense anymore to you. Because you're like, wow, all these experiences that I've had, but this is my state of mind. This is what I'm dealing with now. This is how I have to cope or try to support this person. So people grieve through that. Friendships are, hey, you've had those close friendships where you've had somebody in your life you've cared about, you've loved, supported, been there most of your life, and you lose that friendship. People grieve in that situation too. Miscarriages, women are grieving through the miscarriages. Unfortunately, it's true. They have them and they have to grieve themselves. People say, oh, it's there. No, it's not. That's a part of them that they have to try to cope with. To what extent, I cannot say, but I know that when I've spoken to family members, yeah, there's a part of them that they have to go through a grief. Some of them carry pictures around. Baby could be gone, but they're still carrying the picture. And some people will say, hey, that's kind of weird. Like, that's not right. They shouldn't do that. The baby's gone, let it go. Yes, but it really depends on how long that person needs to grieve. It could take a week. It could take a month. It could take 6 months. It could take a year. If they're working through it, that's their grieving process. No one should be telling them how to grieve. You know, you can't do that. And one thing that I also find too is that there are a lot of people who are attached to their homes. Seriously, they raise their families in their homes, or they love their homes. They design the homes the way that they want, and then they find out, you know what, this home that they raised their family in, they they sell this family home that has meant so many things over all these years, that that's going away. That's not going to exist anymore. Life is going to change forever, right? None of those old memories. Things are just moving forward. So when you sell that family home, you're going to grieve. A number of people will grieve, right? And you can't underestimate the loss of safety after a traumatic event. Whether you've been attacked, right? Or been on the receiving end of some abuse. Some people, it's a grieving process for them. Once that safety is gone and they're vulnerable, they have grief in them. Whether it's their fault or not, right? They've experienced grief. Whether they started something and it turned on them, or they were just victimized, there's a grieving process. See? Because even subtle losses in life can trigger a sense of grief. You know, when you move away from school, you know what I mean? You're in school for a couple years and now you got to come back home and you kind of miss school, and you changed up your environment, you graduated, you moved on. Sometimes some people grieve that experience because they've made so many friends in that environment, right? They've learned so many things. It's been valuable. Teams, it's some of the best times there could be like collaboration and cohesion amongst people. And when that's gone, you feel a sense of loss, and whatever your loss, it's personal to you. So you don't have to feel ashamed about how you feel. You just have to believe that somehow you know you have to grieve over certain things. And people do. They grieve with animals, relationships, or situational things which are significant to them. And as long as you understand, you need to grieve. You don't need to ignore it, fight it. Somehow you have to find out how you can work through the grief. And sometimes you don't do anything. You just take some time for yourself, right? And realize that you need time for yourself. So, whatever the cause of your grief, though, there are healthy ways to cope with this pain that in time can ease your sadness and help you to come to terms with it, with this loss. Sometimes you have to take some time and find new meaning and move on in your life if you can. See, there's a process to grieving that a lot of people don't really understand. This process is a highly individual experience. And there's no one way to do it properly. How you grieve could depend on so many different things. As I mentioned, there's so many ways that people grieve, right? And in those situations, different people are going to handle it differently. See, because how you grieve could depend on your personality, your coping style, some of your experiences, your life experience that you might have had from the past, your religion, your faith, or especially how significant this loss was to you. This grieving process can take many different forms, right? But it takes time. It happens gradually, healing. You can't be forced, right? There's no set time or timetable for this grieving. You feel better in weeks, you could feel better in days, months. As I said, it could be years, but there is no set time. And see, people are insensitive to it because a lot of times you could be with someone who's grieving, could be over a child, the hardest thing to do. And some partners, they don't get over that grief. It takes years, and some do want to move on. It's too much for them. The pain's too much. They can't handle it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to move forward. It's not about a fault, but they just got to move forward. And then there's other ones who are stuck in a rut, which is understandable. And that could be some friction between a relationship. That could cause a lot of problems, right? Especially the death of a loved one. That could be the ultimate challenge, right? Especially when the grief's going on and we're not understanding how grief can unfold and how it could impact people differently. It really can. And we got to be mindful of that when we're dealing with people because we might not feel as deep as someone else. And we might not be ready to move on, but they are. So, how do we deal with it? Like I said, one step at a time. But we have to kind of consider that the grieving process, there are some myths that we have to be aware of, right? Myth being that the pain will go away faster if you ignore it, which is not true. Trying to ignore your pain will not help you at all. It will only make it worse, especially in the long run. It's better if you face your grief and learn or try to deal with it, no matter how much support. It's also a myth that it's important to be strong in the face of loss. Well, people say to be strong in the face of loss is important. And yes, it is important to a certain degree. However, not all the time. No. It's okay to feel sad, frightened. You could be lonely. It's a normal reaction to loss. And for even men out there, crying is okay. It is. It's okay. It doesn't mean you're weak. That you don't. You're not sensitive. It means let it out. You know. You don't need to protect your family by putting on a front. Show your feelings. Show your emotions. Let it out. Work with it. Don't fight it. Don't let it build up. Work with your grief. Try to understand. Understand that you're a human being. Male, female, transgender, lesbian. Just work through it. Don't be afraid to cry and cry as often as you need to. Now, for some men, what I'm saying is you don't need to be crying if you feeling that pressure in front of people. You don't need to cry in front of everybody. You can take some time and find a spot where you cry, where you let it go. Doesn't matter. Quiet spot, right? You don't need to, but if you're in front of people and you cry, don't be ashamed of that either. Let it out. It's real. These are emotions and feelings that we have. Uh-uh. Yeah, uh-uh. But there are people who think that grieving also, which is a myth, they think that grieving should last about a year. And no, as I said, there's no specific time. It's different for different people, and we can't put a time on it, you know? And there are people who also think that if you are dealing with grief and if you are dealing with it effectively, that means you're moving on with your life, which means forgetting about your loss, right? That's what it is. There's a myth out there that people believe that moving on with your life means forgetting about your loss. And it's not true as well. Some people have to try to move on. Some people can't take focusing on it. They can't take sitting in that moment and taking it all in, time again, day after day, or it's just getting too much, or being reminded of it. So they try to push on. Moving on means you've accepted your loss, but that's not the same as forgetting. You're not really forgetting your loss. You've just accepted it. You have to. You can move on with your life if you're ready to keep the memory of someone or something you lost as vitally important to you. Because as we move through these lives, we're going to have plenty of memories and become more and more integral in the lives of other people as well. And our relationships that we have is we can appreciate them. That's why I said always enjoy the moments that you can with friends and family. You know, try to enjoy your moments as much as you can, because these are things that define who we are, and it really helps us when we're going through loss and grief. Being able to reflect on some good memories, not just the negative ones, just reflection. Understanding that the experiences, it's okay to think about them, but when you're ready to move on, you're not forgetting them. You're just taking it at your pace. You're actually doing what's best for you. So how do people deal with the grieving process? Well, I think one of the major parts is we have to recognize the difference between grief and depression, right? Grief and depression. Grief is one thing. Depression, um it goes into real heavy emotions. Grief is you still have a conscious idea of your pain, and you're working with it. However, depression is almost like you get into a set state where you can't change. Grief is you're aware of what's making you feel this way, and you're trying to cope with it. It'll phase in and out of stages, to certain levels. However, depression seems to be more of a permanent state that you find yourself locked in, that it doesn't kind of ease off too often. Once you get into a established state of depression, it's almost like a mindset that you stay in that doesn't fluctuate really. So you need real assistance to work with this depression. Grief takes time. Depression, I don't know about. It's not going to go away with time. It's not. You got to do something for sure. Grief could go away with time, just through learning to move forward and push past and trying to accept certain things. Whereas depression is not really that succinct. Depression is going to be a state of mind where you're going to need some supports for sure, in some sort of way, right? So keep that in mind. And there are stages to grief, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. But dealing with the grieving process is so important when you recognize the difference between grief and depression. Also, you have to acknowledge your pain. Acknowledge that you are feeling it. Acknowledge that you understand that this pain that you're feeling, you're hurting so bad because of this grief, of this loss of a loved one, or this loss of a job, or it's okay to feel. It's okay to get into that state where you recognize that it's a lot, and it doesn't feel good at all, in the sense that you can't see the future where you're going from here, but you're in the moment dealing with it. Do what you can and take it one step at a time and pace yourself, you know. And people react and respond differently to the grief. So accept that grief can trigger many different and other unexpected emotions, especially in that process. It will. When you're feeling grief, it's happened to me. I'm feeling so much grief that I'm somewhere in a different environment, and I might be saying things that just, I'm holding that in, and I'm not even letting it out. And even as a man, when you want to let it out, you just don't let it out anywhere, right? If you do let it out. But I felt like, I recall, and it was like so heavy, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was just in an environment where it was out in the public, and I felt like, wow, I was becoming maybe a little bit verbally confrontational with somebody that was working at this business, and I didn't really mean to, but I kind of lost. It was just something that was getting on, so I started to get escalated, And my partner, she stopped me and she says, "Hey, wait, you're just going through a lot. You got to settle down." And I realized, and I backed myself up, and I apologized, but I went, you know, that is so hard for me to deal with at that moment. It was just taking me over. It was just like I was walking around, and this weight was on my shoulders, was in my mind, it was heavy on my chest, and I didn't really realize how it would impact me. So when I did start to, get a little bit heated, I had somebody there to talk to me about it, but I realized that, yeah, I'm really feeling this grief and this loss. It's taken a big toll on me. And, I had to at some point release some of that stress and anxiety and that loss. I had to work through it. And it took some time. Because I think a lot of times we think because we identify it, that, yeah, okay, we've identified it, now we know how to work through it. Not necessarily. It could still stay in you. You could try to work through it. Yes, that's a positive, but it could still be that strong emotion that leads to other emotions, right? And then decisions that you are making could be based on emotions that are correlated to this grief and this loss, you know. So we just have to understand that this grieving process, just understand that the grieving process will be unique to you as the individual. I also think that it's so important that you seek out some support. And I mean it. I mean like professional help, face to face. A lot of people try to go to family members, and I tell them too often people are going to family members, and I just find that family members have too much bias, you know. And you know what? I'm not saying you can't go to family members. However, I'm saying there are people that will. 90% of the people will go to family members. They will. Because they know the people and they want to talk to them about the people who, they were grieving about or who they've lost. So of course they're going to go to family members. However, because I said that this grieving process could trigger other emotions in you, you might be needing to deal with a number of emotions. And that's where the professional comes into play, seeking out some face to face support, from people, that you might really need at that point in your life. It doesn't have to be forever, but it could be something where you're actually getting the support that you need to deal with that, and if it, however long that goes, that's how you deal with it. Support yourself emotionally by taking care of yourself physically. I say that it's true when you think about it, right? Like, if you're dealing with grief and loss, the best thing you could do is make sure your health is in check and that you're physically active, because the worst thing you could do is just sit around and wallow in your grief. Let's understand though, when we talk about grief, let's get it broken down into, some certain levels, and I would say that there are 5 essential levels to understand when it comes to grief. We have the denial. Well, you just don't want to accept it. I mean, that's happened to family members where they passed on, and the first thing is just what's happened to them. You can't believe this is happening, so you're in denial. Number one, you want to blame somebody, right? You want to point the finger at somebody. You have not accepted it. So the first thing you're going to do is finger what happens, and we do that. Even especially family members that die in institutions like hospitals. First thing they want to do, and you see it on the news. What's the first thing people want to do when they know COVID-19? Those people on the front line are doing the best that they can. The doctors are good. There is no cure, and I know the situation could be better, and we like. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be in denial, and what we're going to do is we're going to go and blame the hospitals, right? We're going to try and sue. We're going to take legal action because we can't accept what happened. And that's what people do. And then the second thing that we get into is that anger. You know, hey, why is this going on? Why am I dealing with this? Who am I? Yeah, I'm blaming this person. Now I'm really angry. I couldn't believe this is going on. I couldn't believe this is happening. First thing to now I'm angry. You know, what? I'm really angry. Because I want somebody to blame, and I'm going to blame somebody. I'll find somebody to blame. But then you get into that psychological state where you start bargaining, you know. Oh man, this can't be happening. Because if I can only get that person back, I'll do anything. If I could just only get that person back so I can speak with them. If I could only say my last goodbyes, I will do this if I could get that. I'll start my bargaining. I'll be Lord, I'll be this. I'll do better in my life. I just need to have this person back. I need them to be with me. I need them to be part of my life. Just for give me 6 months. Give me some time with them. Because it's such a sense of loss. You feel it so deep. You're bargaining. You're willing to do anything to get that situation changed back to the way that you want it. And you don't even want to think or talk about the realization that something's going to really happen. No, you don't even want to consider that. You are just thinking in your mind. That's the state of mind you're in, is I'm willing to do anything to get this situation changed. If I could only. And that's when it gets deep. That's when you go into that deep depth of depression, which is the next. I'm too sad to do anything because I know. I have realized it with all the denial, the anger, and the bargaining. Much as I want to do whatever I can to change the situation, much as I want to blame somebody, and even though I can't believe this is happening to me, I know the situation is not going to change. So what do? Some people get into that depression. Well, you're just too upset. You don't know what to do or say. You get into that state of mind. And sometimes you stay there. People try to bring you out, but you're there. You just don't know how to react. You don't know what to say. You just exist in that state of mind. And it feels hopeless and helpless. And then, for whatever reason, if you work through that depression, you find yourself in a state of acceptance. And that could take a long time. Because I've seen people look at me and say, hey, you know what, this incident, if I'm not crying or not, this incident really doesn't seem like it affected you. You're so strong. I just say, listen, I handle things on my own different way. I try to cope in my own different way. I try to get support if I need it. I'm not perfect anyway. I'm thankful if I have family members to talk to about it. However, if you can do that, if you can work through these things, which you have the power to do, but doesn't feel like it in the moments that you're dealing with it. But if you get to that place where you have accepted what is going on, you are dealing with it. You are coping with it, and you have accepted that you're, you know what? I'm at a place of peace, and I realize that, and I appreciate these are things that have gone on. And now here I am accepting what has happened, and I've got to work with that. So if you're experiencing any of these emotions following a loss, just as long as you know that it's a natural. And you will heal in time, it's just how much, you know. And not everyone goes through those stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Not everybody goes through all those stages. There's some people that skip a few. However, if you do need to get on with your life, you have to at least get through half of it. And you have to come to some point of acceptance. It's really surprising how resilient humans are, too. We see death all the time, and we experience it through our friends, even when we're respecting them and showing up to their funerals. And, it happens. It's a part of life. And it's surprising how resilient some people can be, right? You don't, but other people handle it differently. And people try to judge those people. Oh, you're cold. You didn't show no emotion. It's like you don't even really care. Like they weren't close to them. No, some people don't show. And just because they don't show doesn't mean they don't care. It's just they have to deal with it in their way. Right? They are. There are people also who really go through a lot, and the signs are where they show their their grief and their loss. Some people act right out with that anger, right? That stage of anger. Some take that anger to a new level, and it's destructive. But some people resolve their grief without going through any of these stages. I just think that there's some that I think most do, but they don't acknowledge. But some people would say, hey, I don't go through that. I just don't. I just move on. Well, I think if you move on too much without acknowledging any of these things that are part of these losses, when you experience anything, my belief is when you have certain experiences with certain people, there's things in your subconscious mind that you've experienced with them and they get in your head. And if you've had a great relationship, even if it wasn't so great and you've known the person and, you know, you've had some sort of connection to them, there's a sense that, you know what, you're going to grieve. And in order for you to do that, you need to understand the basics, that how to get through, how to work through it. And just understanding these things it's good for you, right? So just acknowledging. So how do you know if somebody is grieving? Because some people say you can't tell, which it is very hard for some people to tell, because especially if they're not extroverts and they're maybe introverts. And these people might not be as expressive as people who are very emotional and they tie these emotions strongly to their decision makings and their expressions. So, what could be some of the symptoms of your grief? Well, loss affects people in many different ways, and many of us experience the following symptoms, like shock and belief, sadness, guilt, anger, fear, right? Like shock and disbelief. Sorry, you haven't accepted it. You've been in shock. You feel numb. You trouble believing in what happened. You deny the truth. That's an emotional symptom of grief. You keep expecting them to show up, right? Oh, if that person were just here, or you're thinking that they're gonna. That's a mind state that you get into. You keep thinking that that person is gonna show up, even though you know they're gone. And that sadness, that profound sadness, it's most spread feeling around the world when there's grief. Those feelings of sadness and emptiness and despair, deep loneliness, you know, just a lot of crying. And that's okay. And what about that guilt we talked about? That feeling, you didn't do. I told you, I didn't feel like I didn't do, or I didn't say enough with my aunt. I just felt like it was just guilt. It was that such heavy guilt, you know. And I hate to say this, but the truth is that I was feeling so much guilt that after the person, my aunt, passed away for a while, I started to feel relieved somewhat. You know that, and it's a shame to say that she had passed on with this illness because I couldn't stand to hear about her suffering. I heard about the bed sores and the turning, and I just felt like they had to turn her all the time, and she kept having bed sores and things like that, and that's from not a lot of movement, right? And the staff shortages, but because of it, I loved her, but I've just felt that it was a very challenging disease and it really took its toll on her to the point of expiration. But I felt there was a mercy part of me that said this woman does not need to suffer anymore. So when she did pass, there was some sort of relief of that guilt, you know? But then it went back to could I have done more? Even though I realize now I haven't done I'd done everything that I could. I couldn't have done any more. And that anger, it subsided. I knew just by the relationships that I had with staff members before that that symptom of anger that I used to have, because I used to be a little snappy, right? When I went to the retirement home, why are you doing this? Are you doing that? And when they would say that, I'd be like, well, why not? And they would just look at me, they're short staffed. So I understood, but I was just like, okay, I got to check that because I know that they're the ones who are stepping up. It's easy to get lost in those feelings, right? It's easy to just care for yourself and start putting demands on other people. It's easy, especially when you're looking from the outside in. And it wasn't fair. And I had to check myself. I just felt like my anger made me think that I had to blame somebody. And even though I wasn't using names or whatever, I was acting in a certain way, right? But I know the one thing too that happened is once she was gone, it just reignited that feeling of fear. It almost brought back that feeling. Like, I don't know how many people can understand. Like when I was younger, the one question I asked my mother was, you know what? Are we all gonna die someday? And for some reason that fear came back of actually us as human beings when our numbers are gonna be up. See, when somebody died, like my aunt, it just started me thinking of life, not just being a pressure life. Like, hey, we are going to. It's like we go every day and we don't even think about that a lot of times when our numbers up until something tragic happens in our family. But then when it does happen, it could bring on, right, a trigger, in me, like it did, the worry, the fear, the anxiousness, helplessness. I was feeling very insecure. There was one point I was having like a little panic attack, you know? Started thinking about my own life, what I'm doing and how I'm going about my life, and am I taking care of myself, or this going to catch on to me? Because it very well, I don't care what people say about it being most seniors. It's not all seniors. There are a number of people who are catching it, and they're not just seniors. It might be 80%, but 20% is still a large enough number for me. And that right there adds to my fear and adds to my pain. I think one day I was in one of those grocery stores and I started to feel my chest pumping hard. I started to have a panic attack. And I was like, whoa, it's too busy in here. I'm not feeling good. Like, so there are certain places you can go, but that can add to this fear, right? Because this is something I think most people have a little bit of fear of. Some people say they don't, but they do. They just don't want to acknowledge it. I don't have no fear at all. Listen, maybe you don't, but rarely. Most people have a little bit of fear because it's the unknown a lot of the time, right? And it's the known. You know that you can't catch it. And then if you know that somebody beside you is not looking so healthy, that fear. But when you know someone has passed in your family, then you know right there that could happen to you. It could happen to you. It could be in your family for sure. So think about some of the symptoms when you are feeling this grief that you have to acknowledge. Because I know myself, I was feeling my body was tight. I was feeling the aches and pains. Started losing weight. Just didn't feel the need to eat anymore. Just was feeling down. Food, the taste wasn't just, I was just being tired, sleeping all the time, body sore. Sometimes I'd stand up and I'd be feeling a little dizzy. It's just too worrisome. I had to talk to my family and get out of the spots every once in a while because these were some of the symptoms I was experiencing. That fatigue, the weight loss, my muscles were sore, right? From lack of movement. I was up all through the night. I just felt like my immune system was just down. And I don't know if it translated into my mind that when somebody passed on that I started to deplete with my energy and my will to just survive and thrive. Like it impacts you in that way sometimes. It can. And if you don't do anything about it, that you can start going down. I'm a very strong believer that our thoughts and our physical and our mental state, they're connected. That's it. You can't separate the two. You know that. You've heard of. We've talked about this before, where there's two people who loved each other, been together for 30 years, married couple, right? or married or not, but a married couple married together for years, one person dies and the other person for no health reasons or they end up dying. The love, the connection, the physical, the mental, oh yes, it's connected. But that physical um, symptoms that I'm talking about that you could have, just be aware of them. If you're feeling nauseous, then whoa, watch it. Tired all the time, careful, you know. But one of the most important things you got to do is you got to get your sleep. You got to. Some people will sleep for long periods of time, but you got to get your sleep, but you don't want to oversleep. And if you're experiencing some of those symptoms, then you're going to have to do some changes. You got to make sure you start targeting those areas and improving yourself as a person, developing yourself better to where you're functioning, you know, in a more sustainable state where you're being active and healthy, not being inactive and unhealthy and just going about it in a slump. You got to get some support. And yes, we talked about turning to friends because it's important that you turn to friends and family members for sure. But I told you, it is time to lean on people who care about you, you know. And if you are going to lean on them, make sure that you are self sufficient and you have your confidence and your strength within you to be able to express yourself. You know, draw your friends in and gain your inner confidence. Draw your family in and talk to them about it. Just make sure you're not doing a whole lot of complaining and, you know, exerting some of your energy into negativity. And try as much as you can to get some of that face to face communication. It's nice over the phone. If you have to over the phone, that's one thing. But try to get that face to face communication. And accept people too. You have to accept that many people feel just as awkward as you may be feeling, you know, especially when they're going through this grieving thing. It can be a confusing time, very frightening for many people, especially if they haven't experienced loss before. You know, they might be feeling unsure of how to comfort you, and they might not say the right things, or they might not react the way you expect them to. It's true. It happens all the time. They might not feel the way you're doing things is right. So they might tell you, hey, you're not dealing right. You're doing the wrong way. You're not coping the right way. You're going about it the wrong way. But don't treat that as an excuse. You know what I mean? No, don't do that. Don't let them know who you are and cope with it on your level. Don't start getting directed to start becoming somebody you're not because then that brings on bigger issues. Don't start doing that. And if people reach out to you, be open, you know, and accommodating in a sense. Don't be too accommodating. Understand how much you can take as an individual because grieving and loss can get deep. And some people are going to get deeper than others, and they're going to be trying to get your attention. But you have to make sure you're not giving them too much attention to the point where you start to get into a funk, a depression, a super sadness because you're listening to it all the time. Limit it, cut it, know your boundaries. And there are people out there who, when they want to deal with these this grief and some sort of lot, they turn to their faith, their religion. They do it. It's a tradition. And if that's what gets you by, then that's what gets you by. Use your spiritual activities, you know, make them meaningful. Like the meditating and the praying and going to church and whatever people do, they do it. That's how they cope. These are just different ways that people can cope with their grief and loss. It's very common. And if you find it's getting too much and you still need more or an alternative, because not everybody's into religion and faith, but support group. They could be helpful too. Just hearing other people speak about things that they're going through can just be a relief. You don't necessarily have to go in there and tell your whole story or get everything out, but sometimes just listen to people. Go to hospitals or funeral homes and counseling centers and places that that person might have lived where they might have a friend and talk to. But a support group could be a wonderful, wonderful coping strategy for some grief and some loss. But I'm always about counselors and therapists. Because I think that they're trained and they are there with skills that really get you thinking. And it's unbiased opinion. And they can help you work through intense emotions, and they can help you overcome some obstacles to your grieving. Now, the one thing I'm very cautious about is when people are using social media for grief support. There are people out there who have social media groups and sites, which I'm very cautious about because you don't know sometimes who's behind some of those images, but you have to be aware of these things. But be careful when you are on social media. It has its risks because anybody can open up any of these social media accounts and talk about it. Like, even if you've heard of people who've had some grief and some loss, and I'm going to tell you, okay, so family member had someone pass away, and so they decided to form their own little group, right? Which is natural and normal. However, when they formed a group, they set up a GoFundMe account, in which some of you might know about GoFundMe, is where people might want to put money together and donate money to an account to support the family members of somebody who's lost, etc., or help pay some bills the person might have left behind. It's just all put together so that they can be supportive. However, you got to be careful because I've seen family members fighting over where the money goes, how much, you know what I mean, who's taking care of this, and there's people who've had taken advantage of the situation, and then there's a lot of squabbling amongst family members. So be careful what you say, and then what you say through text doesn't go away, right? So if you, for example, are in your media groups and you're talking about this individual and you don't agree with anyone, somebody could take your comments and your emails or your text and they could hold them, and then they could throw them to people and then start reflecting off them. So whatever you say stays. So you got to keep that in mind. So when you're grieving, if you don't want more stress or more headache, be mindful of what you say, especially when you're using social media. You just got to take care of yourself as you grieve. Face your feelings, right? As much as you try to suppress your grief, you can't avoid it. So just face it, and express your feelings in a creative way. Do that. Like I always say, write a journal, write in a book, write to a loved one. Letters, I love them. Get into the letters, you know? Make a scrapbook or portfolio about the person who passed away. Be creative. And maybe give it to a loved one so that they can reflect. Or you might have pictures of this person that they might not have. So you put them together. It's such a wonderful gesture. I've seen it done so many times. People helping, people grieve so many different ways. Some people even pick up hobbies and interests, you know, just cope so that they can feel a sense of self and joy and connect closer to other people, you know, who are dealing with the grieving process themselves. As long as you're not letting people tell you how you feel, you know, don't tell yourself how you should feel either. That's a big mistake. Just feel it. Don't say I shouldn't be feeling this way, I shouldn't be acting this way. Just feel it, acknowledge it, accept it. It's a real feeling, this grief inside of you. And that you will, through time, learn how to move on. And you will get over it. And you will have that mindset that you're going to try to be positive. But just let yourself feel what you are feeling without judgment, without being embarrassed, without taking on too much peer pressure. I mean, you have to know that it's okay to be angry. You know what I mean? It's okay to yell or scream, and people do it. Especially when they're going through the churches and they're going through the family members who are getting together. There's people who are going to yell and they're going to scream. Don't be scared by it. It's just how they're expressing themselves. It could freak some people out, but don't let it. Understand that people handle it differently. But I'm also a big believer in planning. Yeah. So you know that when you're going through this process, there are going to be certain things that are going to trigger you. See, you might have, like my aunt, like when she passed on, see, one thing we always did was we always got together on her birthday and we always celebrated. And then we'd celebrated the holidays at the end of the year, right? So those were dates. And there will be dates that really, are stuck in my head that were specific to her. And so those were days I could count on. It became the norm. It happened throughout the years. So I kind of, when I knew that her birthday was coming along, you know what I mean? It was something that I had to acknowledge too. I had to plan. What am I going to do there? I don't want to be sitting around just overthinking about her. Maybe I could get together with one of her kids or something and realize that they could be going through it too, or maybe not getting together. Maybe I needed to take a break then. This is what I'm talking about with something personal. Try to plan ahead when you know there's our events, there's reminders out there, if birthdays, anything that can remind you of that person. Try to plan how you can cope during those times because it might come to you. Trying to avoid it is not great at all. You know what I mean? So what you want to do is, if you know it's coming up and you have family members, try to talk to them about, hey, are you doing anything? Is there something we can do? If you're ready to do that, or hey, I've been thinking about this person, and then next thing you know, you're striking up conversation, or you do something for that family, whatever. But you got to remember, planning ahead for these things can help alleviate some of the stress because you know it's going to happen. But most importantly, I think looking after your health is important above all else. When you're feeling healthy, you're feeling down, but if you're still taking care of your health, you're going to be ready to work on that stress, ready to keep that fatigue in check. You're going to make sure you're eating healthy, sleeping right, and exercising. But don't try and overindulge in drugs and alcohol. That is one thing that North America is very big on, getting you into the drugs and alcohol. Because I'll tell you, I got family members and they drink. And when they drink, especially when in times like that, see, when you're in certain cultures, especially when someone who passes and grief and loss process goes down, well, when they immediately pass, there's certain people that have their funerals, then they have a big, it's not a party, it's just to get together where people are reflected, and a lot of that could be drinking and drugs. And the thing is that you got to be careful with that because a lot of emotions, I told you earlier, some of that emotions will come out in you and it will show up in different ways. And it might be that anger. You might be at that angry phase where you're in a big gathering and you're drinking and you're under the influence and you're just splurting out everything. You're reacting all over the place because you got to get it out. But what you're doing is you're not putting it out there constructively. You're just acting out. You're just saying things, and it's sometimes hurtful. If you're that person. And what you do is you give yourself that excuse. Oh, I'm drinking, I'm doing drugs, and what I think matters, and what you think don't matter. And when I'm drunk, I'm going to give myself the excuse that I'm going to tell you about yourself. And I'm going to tell you why you didn't like this person. I'm going to tell you what you didn't understand about them. You got to be careful with that because you could create more issues than you really intended to. So you have to make sure that you're drinking and your drugs. No, cut that out. You shouldn't be doing none of that, especially when you're going through the grieving process. Because you could also find yourself in a deep hole as well. Mentally, you might be thinking harder, and there's people that do that. They get into the drinking and the drugs, they end up over consuming, and boom, they're gone. And next thing you know, people are grieving over them. Watch it, especially having alcohol and drugs around young people, especially during the grieving process. Life can be hard enough, but adding the drinking and the drugs to that, oh no, you don't want to really do that. You don't. You don't want to mix the two in any sort of way. You have to maintain control of yourself, but keeping your exercise and your health. Focus on keeping your health intact, and your mind will follow. Take care of your body. Take care of your health, because when you go through these slumps, you can bounce back. But if you get into such a point where you start getting down, depressed, your body's not functioning, and then all of a sudden you add drugs to it, oh no, that's the difference between risk and resilience. See, risk is when you have all those factors out there, negative factors. You know what I mean? Negative factors that you keep compiling, like the drinking, the negative thoughts. And next thing you know, they become overwhelming. Where if you have protective factors, you like for your kids or whatever, you're going through this, that maybe You know, you lost a family member and you have kids in your family. You don't bring drugs and alcohol not around. They can consume that. So what you do is you put in the protective factors. Have them around environments where they're not going to be easily influenced by this stuff if they're going through this state or overindulging. Because that's what we do in North America a lot of times. We try to handle or manage our behavior through substance abuse or use. Most people get offended if I say substance abuse or use. I think it's substance abuse because I think if you're doing it too much, period, if you're doing it consistently, it ends up affecting you some way. Some people say, oh no, but it does. Anything you do to yourself affects you. And it doesn't help you become a better person. You're already dealing with enough. You don't need that. So, grief is one thing that people just always wonder, when am I going to stop feeling this pain? When is it going to stop so ill affecting my body? When am I going to not feel this sadness, this sense of loss? When am I going to feel me again? Well, as time passes, following a significant loss, such as the death of someone, normal feelings of sadness, numbness, and anger, they will ease gradually. But as these emotions become less intense, you begin to accept the loss and you will start to move on. Because grief is complicated. It never goes away completely. Especially when people remind you of something, then you get it back. But you're not as affected. You know, most people, not all people. Some people you don't talk to them, as soon as they hear that name, boom, they go into crying and there's nothing wrong with that. See, that's what we think. There's something wrong. There's nothing wrong with feeling your pain and your emotions and understanding yourself and understanding it's okay to let loose and get rid of some of that weight, because we're always get excess weight on our body. We take on a lot. We do. If we could just recognize things that carry so much weight to us and eliminate some of them or work through them, we're going to be better off, right? It's just so important to understand. Grief, it can be complicated. Complicated grief is like being stuck in an intense state of mourning. You may have trouble accepting a death long after it has occurred. So you become preoccupied with that person. And that ends up impacting your daily routine, your daily life. And it undermines your relationships. I told you, it's deep. It's complicated grief. And some of the symptoms can be intense, longing, and yearning for your deceased loved one. Intrusive thoughts or images of your loved one that you might have. We talked about the denial or disbelief. Imagining your loved ones alive, searching for your deceased loved ones in familiar places, or avoiding things that remind you of that loved one. You like to feel life is nothing but emptiness, or your life's not meaningful. And like I said, the most common one is going to be anger. But just make sure you know that when we talk about grief, don't try to compile them up as if they're the same grief and depression, because they're not. There are differences between grief and depression. It's not easy to understand, but you do need to understand distinguishing between grief and clinical depression isn't always easy, as they share many symptoms, but there are differences. And the grief can be a roller coaster. It involves a wide variety of emotions, of mixed and good and bad days. Even when you're in the middle of the grieving process, you still have moments of some pleasure, right, and happiness. There will be those. But with depression, I told you, it's a state that you want, with depression on that, it's feelings of emptiness and despair. They're constant. So just make sure you know the differences. Don't try to say they're the same. They're not. And you can tell if somebody's not snapping out of it every while. If they're always down, then you got to get some help for them. You do. Don't wait for them to get some help. If they're never coming out of it and they're staying in that state of funk and they don't seem to put their head above water every once in a while, or they're hiding too much, no. I'm sorry. Can't let it go on too long. You got to, this is what we're about. We're humans. We got to check in. We got to do something, So symptoms of depression, it's that intense, pervasive sense of guilt. Thoughts of suicide or preoccupation with dying. Feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. slow speech and body movements, inability to function at home, work, or school, seeing and hearing things that aren't there, that's depression, right? That's depression. So get that counselor, get that help, get that support person, and let them know. And you know what? You could even get a specific counselor because there's different counselors out there. Get a grief counselor or a professional therapist. Get them. Let them know. You know, if you're feeling that life isn't up to par and it's not worth living, let them know. If you're feeling it, or even talking to people and saying, oh, you know, I wish I had died. Because there's a lot of people that do that, you know, and they get to that state where they don't know what to do or know what to feel. So what do they say? Oh, I wish I was dead. And the other person's like, what? What'd you just say? You know, you might have said it. I bet you most of you said that at one point. I wish I was dead. Something was going down that you said that. And that takes the other person to that point where they're like, what? And see, you backtrack because you're worried about what that other person is thinking, right? You're worried about, oh my goodness, I just said something. It just came out of me. Like, it just came out. And I just impacted that person. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to. So you make them feel good. And, oh, I was just saying that. You know what? I don't really mean that. What? You better get some counseling. Don't lie to yourself if you're feeling that way. If it came out of your mouth, that person heard it, and you're one of those people that just heard your friend say it, and you're like, they won't do it. And you're hoping that they will. They might not do it today. They might not do it tomorrow. They might not do it next month. But try to get them help. There's nothing wrong with saying, no, you're going to need some help. I'm sorry. You need somebody to talk to. Because if I'm hearing that, I mean, you're in a serious state. And there's a lot of us, 90%, we turn our back and they're okay, 90%. But there's a percentage that's not. And it may be because of some of the stereotypes of getting help. Right? Tell your therapist. You might be blaming yourself for the loss, for either preventing the loss of someone. You might not feel connected to society, you know, for a long period of time. And if you're feeling that, you do need help. Especially trusting other people, especially since a loss. You might have trust issues. And if it's interrupting your daily life and your activities in your daily life and your relationships, then that is more important than anything that you get some support. And I gotta say, this is a heavy topic, but we do need to talk about grief and loss because many of us are going through it, especially today. And it's something that we have to acknowledge and try to understand better and try to be sustainable in these harsh times, right? We have to try to keep our heads up, keep working on things because it's so important. I want to say thank you to all my listeners out there. And you know what? I want you to spread the word. I want you to talk to some friends and get them to listen because these are topics that are very relevant and they're important. And they should be important to all of us, whether we like to look at them or not. We all play a role. We all have things going on different levels, and you can't read people's minds. And the only way a lot of times people are going to know what's going on with you and you with them is if you start working on it and start doing some reflecting and some learning about what you can do. And it's not always in the counselor's hands. There's a lot that you can do as an individual. There really is. And if you've heard me today, then you know there's a lot you can do. So thank you, my listeners, and I'm wishing you a good evening until we speak again. Take care of yourselves and spread the word like the wise old bird. Take care.